When I was around 24, I lost my full-time job as a freelance writer due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It got really bad around my area to the point where the company was losing money and had to lay off many workers. Because of this, I became broke and nearly got evicted from my apartment. During this time, I had my parents help out with rent and did DoorDash on the side to make some extra income. It wasn't the best paying job, but it helped me get around and paid for things I needed. I ended up doing deliveries pretty often and thought it was the perfect little side hustle. One night, I had been doing deliveries around the suburbs of my city. This was the type of area where you'd normally get more orders, which typically meant you'd get more money. So I'm driving around when I get a delivery from a local mom and pop type of restaurant. It was a large order, and the person who had ordered it was on the other side of town, which was annoying. However, DoorDash charges more per mile, and seeing as it was a large order, I realized it was a bigger tip. Sucking it up, I drive the 25-minute drive to the given address and eventually pulled into a house with an unkept driveway. The house seemed okay, but the grass was tall and there didn't appear to be any lights on. This should have been the first red flag, but being young and naive, I dismissed it and proceeded with the order. Now, DoorDash has the option for a customer to request their order be left by the door, which is exactly what this person wanted. I walk up to the house, and as I'm about to put their order down, the front door opens where I was greeted to a man. He looked as if he had just woken up and said in a groggy voice if I was the delivery guy. Clearly annoyed, but not trying to be rude, I tell him yes. Then, for whatever reason, he asks me if I could bring it to his backyard for him, as that's where all of his guests were gonna be. Why he was having guests over during the pandemic was his problem, but I wasn't gonna get involved. While his request was weird, I didn't think much of it, as it was a large order and was definitely something you couldn't feed one person. Without hesitation, I make my way to the back, and right when I turn the corner, I see 4 chairs and a dining table beside a shed. As I put the food on the table, I look at the shed and thought I could see someone looking at me through the window. Even with it being dark out, I could still make out the face to be a woman. However, the weird part about it was that she appeared to be sad for some reason. It was kind of like that look you would give someone as if their whole life was falling apart. The closest term I could really describe it was depressed or disappointed. It was then where the man had come out and thanked me for my help. I then leave the house to go back home, still confused out of my mind. It wasn't until about a week later where I had met up with a friend in the area when I learned a harsh truth. I had told him about my weird delivery trip the other night to that man's house. Upon describing the man, he said he knew who I was talking about and he would do deliveries for him here and there. It was then where I had mentioned the woman I had seen, and that's when he told me something I didn't know. My friend and this man had managed to strike up a conversation one day and told him something personal. Turns out, his wife had suffered from a heart attack in his backyard one day and didn't survive. He was heartbroken and obviously grieved for a long while after her passing. From time to time, he had caught glimpses of her inside of his gardening shed, as she always loved planting. That was her go-to place for whenever she was feeling down or upset. Gardening was always her passion, and she'd do it whenever she could. That was the creepiest and saddest experience I've ever had while on any shift. I'm an 18-year-old female, and this happened to me just last week while working. For context, I work for a widely popular pizza chain around the country as a delivery driver. I won't name the place or location. I'm not getting paid for advertisement. Anyway, the restaurant was busy all day every day, which meant that I'd be doing deliveries left and right. Business wouldn't start to slow down until at least an hour before closing, so it was hectic to say the least. One night, my boss had called me in on my day off, asking if I was able to work that night as someone had called out. After all, I wasn't really doing anything that night, so I said why not and drove over to work. The second I get there, I clock in, and it was then when our phone rang with a man's voice requesting a large pie. However, the second he knew I was a female, the tone in his voice completely changed. In a sort of flirtatious manner, he had given me the address and how he wanted the pizza delivered. I told my coworker that I needed one regular and to hand it to me when ready. It was then when I noticed the order barely met our delivery radius, and I even asked my boss if it was still worth doing. I could tell he was in sort of a rush and didn't have time for questions or concerns, so I decided to do it. I put in the guy's address and went on my way to do what I hoped was my last delivery. It wasn't too far out, but it was then when I realized that the area I was in wasn't the best in town. It was one of those areas with run-down homes and unkept lawns where you'd commonly hear sirens every now and then. And being a small, petite college student, it was concerning being around here as crime here was at its highest. It was sketchy, but knew I could finally go home once I completed the delivery. I pull up to the townhouse my GPS led me to and immediately see that there were no cars in the driveway. However, there was a single light on, meaning there was indeed someone home. For those of you who don't know what a townhouse is, it's basically several homes fused together into one. Anyway, I step out of the car with the pizza in hand and knocked on the door as there was no doorbell. Within a minute, the door opens and I was greeted to a man who appeared to be in his mid-20s wearing, out of all clothes, a tuxedo. He was tall and his hair was a mess and honestly looked disheveled. The smell of strong alcohol could be noticed from his clothes, which wasn't attractive at all. He greeted me, introducing himself as Nate, and immediately grabbed the pizza from my hands. He opens it and looks back at me with a smile and says, "You know, I wouldn't be able to eat this pizza by myself. Would you mind coming inside to share?" I uncomfortably laugh and politely decline, telling him I had to go home and that I had to watch the carbs. However, he then insists, telling me how he was this great guy and how he could buy me all these nice things. This time in a more direct tone, I tell him no thank you, but that he was very thoughtful and to have a nice night. Suddenly, he then stops me, telling me he forgot to give me my tip. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill and handed it to me, making sure our hands touched. Now, this is the part where things really took a turn for the worst. As I was about to turn around and leave to go home, I hear clear as day this loud and blood-curdling scream from upstairs. He looks up at the pitch-dark hallway of his house and then back at me. It was then where his demeanor completely changed. This time, in a more serious tone of voice, he had said, I think it's time for you to go." I felt my blood run cold as he said this and ran back to the car, pulling out of his driveway, not looking back. As I'm in the car, I'm calling my boss, who was still at the restaurant, practically crying to him about the situation. He had said to come right back and that he was calling the police. When I arrived, police were already outside waiting with my boss. For a good while, I was questioned and gave them the address I made the delivery to. It's safe to say I didn't hear anything from police for a good week until I finally got a call back. Turns out, the man who I had made the delivery to had actually owned the house with his parents. The woman screaming was his now ex-girlfriend who he had caught cheating with another man. The part that disturbed me the most was that he had beat her numerous times after he found out. She had been in his house for days and wouldn't let her leave until she, quote, learned a lesson. He was obviously arrested, and his ex was taken to a hospital where she thankfully did survive. The next day, I quit my job and now work as a desk representative. If there's one thing I've learned from this, is that always trust your gut when something feels off. So I've been a delivery driver for about 3 years ever since the start of the pandemic. It's a lot more stressful than people think, and I've dealt with several different customers, but this one takes the prize. It was a Thursday, and I had been doing Uber Eats orders for people who just preferred to stay home. Most of the time, I do orders until really late in order to keep the cash flowing. Since this was around the time where these delivery apps really started to take off, I took advantage of it and worked both Uber Eats and DoorDash. On this particular day, I had been using Uber Eats. Not before long, I had received one order from a house that wasn't too far away, and the order was pretty big, which basically meant an extra tip. I drive to the given restaurant, obtain the order, and drive the 10-minute drive to the given address. On this day, it happened to be raining, and one thing I've always hated was driving in the rain. But I had to make my money somehow. It's about 4 in the afternoon, and as I'm driving, I turn into the road where the house was. Now, in order to get to this house, you'd have to go down this narrow pathway that cuts straight into a wooded area. To say the least, it was pretty much a well-hidden path unless you accidentally stumbled upon it or knew where you were going. I pull onto this dirt road, driving as slowly as I can, and pull up to a small one-storied house. At the front of this house was a man sitting in his rocking chair, listening to the rain. I get out of my car and he gets up to come help me with the food. At first, he genuinely seemed like a pleasant guy. He looked like your typical redneck, but he was respectful and apologized for the confusion of his location. I had said that it wasn't a problem and to have a nice day. Before I was about to get back in my car, he then asks if I wanted to come inside to try some pastries he had made earlier. I politely decline and tell him I had to get back to doing orders. However, he didn't even seem to acknowledge my response and simply insisted that I go inside with him. Once again, I declined, telling him I was sorry and that I'm sure they were good. No matter how many times I said no, he'd always make attempts for me to agree, even going as far as raising my tip. This time, I was visibly annoyed, but still kept my composure while giving him a firm no. I then take out my phone, pretending I was on a phone call with another customer. This thankfully made him stop asking me, causing him to go inside with his food. When he did, I hop back into my car, start my engine, and sped off. As I'm driving back down this narrow road, I then see him speed walking after my car from my rearview mirror. Now, if the story had ended there, it wouldn't be scary. But this story comes with a very unsettling twist. That night when I had gotten home, my girlfriend and I had sat down on the couch watching the news. At one point, there was a chilling news report about a man in the area attempting to lure kids into his truck. As much as I hate to say it, we lived in an area that wasn't so great, so stuff like this did happen occasionally. But when this news report showed the person responsible, I almost spit out the water I was drinking. On my TV was the same man I had taken the delivery order from, causing me to go absolutely hysterical. He had the same face, same beard, and the same hair. I just knew it was him. Turns out, he was arrested shortly after I had delivered his food. After all, I knew there was something off about that man. And boy, did I end up being correct. Update, April 17th, 2023. The man I had delivered food to has now gotten out of prison for good behavior. I later found out from another source that he had done the same thing to other delivery drivers recently. The part that still bothers me, he hasn't been caught as of yet.